Now, telling you about the philosophy of George Berkeley. It's a bit of a motorbike ride through the main points, I'm afraid, on this, but it's something to do with the university, I suppose. Now, Descartes, the person I was just talking about, is a rationalist, and Locke and Berkeley are empiricists. There's a debate about what it means to be an empiricist and what it means to be a rationalist. And the intuitive or informal way in which this distinction is put over is as follows. It's said that rationalism is the view that pure thinking is the best guide to reality, and empiricism is the view that experience is the best guide to reality. Now, I think that that way, of drawing the distinction is not false. It's not wrong, but it's rather vague and in some ways misleading. Now, what are we doing when we distinguish between rationalism and empiricism? What we're trying to do is find a pair of definitions that will group the philosophers we regard as rationalists in the rationalist category and group the philosophers we regard as empiricists in the empiricist category. Now, I don't know whether there's much point in doing that, or I'm not clear why we're doing that. But we do it a lot in philosophy. When we try and define the word knowledge, and we have a stab at knowledge as justified true belief, as Plato says in the Theaetetus, and as Ayers says in the Problem of Knowledge, what we're trying to do is take our intuitive idea of knowledge and sharpen it up by finding logically necessary and sufficient conditions for X being an item of knowledge, or P being known. And here, what we're trying to do is find logically necessary and sufficient conditions for something being rationalist and for something being empiricist. I mean, necessary condition here means that X has to have it in order to be X. And sufficient condition here means that if something has it, it's X. A sufficient condition of being X means if something has this feature, then it is X. It follows that it's X. Somebody might say that, I don't know, having shape is a necessary condition of being a physical object, or having size is a necessary condition of being a physical object, or having shape, size, and mass, and some other features are singly necessary, but altogether they're sufficient for being a physical object. Somebody could take this view. Now, I think that rationalism is the disjunction of these two positions. Number one, some synthetic a priori knowledge is metaphysical. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. Some synthetic a priori knowledge is metaphysical. Or, this is the other half of this disjunction, or some knowledge is innate. I think that rationalism is that disjunction. And I think that empiricism is the negation of the first part of rationalism. Empiricism entails that no synthetic a priori knowledge is metaphysical, and empiricism, which is a conjunction, not a disjunction, empiricism, the other half of empiricism is all knowledge depends on experience. All knowledge depends on experience. Now, I think that these two definitions capture rationalism and empiricism. Now, the reason I have to define these terms in this way is that rationalist philosophers, Spinoza, Leibniz, Descartes, Malebranche, do privilege reason over experience, but they put enormous emphasis and respect, have enormous respect for experience and the empirical findings of science. And empiricist philosophers, it's true that they privilege experience over the exercise of reason, but if we look at empiricist philosophers, Hobbes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Russell, Mill, Ayer, these people have enormous respect for logic and mathematics, things that belong to the mind, and they think that there's plenty of mathematical knowledge. Now, I use the notion of a synthetic a priori proposition here. Well, I don't use the word proposition, right? Synthetic a priori knowledge. Well, supposing I say that God, so consider these sentences, God exists, there is life after death, there was a first event, numbers are abstract objects. Now, these claims might be true or might be false. Philosophers argue it either way, as we well know. But I think these claims have the logical status of being synthetic a priori. Now, what does a priori mean? A claim or a theory or some knowledge or a belief or some item that might be true or might be false is a priori if you can work it out in your head. That's what a priori means. You can work it out in your head. To put the point in a more sophisticated and respectable way, to say that P is a priori is to say that P's truth value may be decided purely intellectually, or just by thinking about it. So most philosophers think that arithmetic is a priori. You can work it out in your head. You might have to go to primary school to acquire the concepts, but once you've got the concepts, you can do the sums by working it out in your head rather than go and looking. If somebody says there are two and only two chairs next door, someone else has not taken any chairs away but has added two more chairs, how many chairs are there now? It would be inappropriate to say, well, I'm not sure, I'll go and have a look. Okay? You can work it out a priori. Now, synthetic means informative or could come as news or gives information. Synthetic implies not just a tautology or not just true by definition. So I'm saying that those sentences that I just mentioned, God exists and so on, are both synthetic and a priori. Now, rationalists like Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz think that you can prove or find out interesting things like the ones on that list by the exercise of thought. They can find these things out a priori, and yet they're informative. They're not just definitions or linguistic truths. These are substantial truths, if they're true at all. Now, empiricists think that it's not possible to arrive at any facts which are synthetic and a priori and metaphysical. By metaphysical, I mean pertaining to reality as a whole, or pertaining to non-empirical reality, or pertaining to what is as it is, as opposed to appearance, or pertaining to reality as opposed to appearance. Empiricists think that everything that's known can only be known because there is experience. And empiricists clearly agree, or often agree, that there is a priori knowledge. They agree that there's a priori knowledge, but empiricists think that a priori knowledge is knowledge of definitions, or knowledge of tautologies, or knowledge of facts only within logic, or only within mathematics, or only within language. And empiricists deny that anything metaphysical, such as facts about immortality, or the existence of God, or the origin of the universe, can be found out a priori. Now, if you accept these two definitions, one of rationalism and one of empiricism that I've just given, the rationalists, Leibniz, Spinoza, Descartes, come out as rationalists, and the empiricists, Hobbes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Mill, Eyre, Moore, and so on, Russell, come out as empiricists. Now, Locke is an empiricist philosopher. In fact, in his book, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, or the Essay for short, in book 2 of the essay, Locke says, all ideas come from sensation or reflection. All ideas come from sensation or reflection. This expresses, in a way, Locke's empiricism. Now, Locke's idea of an idea is much broader than our idea of an idea. By idea, he includes mental images, but also concepts, but up to a point, even beliefs, things that we wouldn't actually count as ideas today. An idea is anything that is the object of thinking, anything that's the object of the mind. Now you might say, well, New York with yellow taxis on Fifth Avenue might be the object of my mind at the moment, but that doesn't make it an idea. But by object of the mind, he means direct object of the mind. He means the idea is the image of New York that you have in your mind, not the city in the United States. That's the idea. But all ideas come from sensation or reflection. Well, sensation is sense perception, according to Locke, or more accurately, the content of sense perception. The sensation is his word for the sensations that are sensed in sense perception. The colour as seen, the pain as felt, the pure phenomenology, that which is given, if anything is given, in perception. That's what he means by sensation. And by reflection, he defines reflection as the perception of the operations of our own mind within us. The perception of the operations of our own mind within us. In other words, reflection is introspection, or he thinks that there's a faculty of inner awareness or inner sense where the mind can become aware of its own operations. Now, Locke thinks that absolutely everything that you've ever thought is acquired in one of these two ways. It's either acquired through sensation, i.e. through the senses, kinesthetic sensations like touch, or it's acquired through introspection. We've got no other access to anything whatsoever, according to Locke. That's it. That's it. If anybody knows anything about anything at all, it's through these two routes. This constraint is even more acute because there is no reflection without sensation. There is no reflection without sensation. So the operation of the mind on itself, those operations can only ever unveil the findings of sensation. Now, okay, that shows his empiricism. We'll have all that as point one. Now, there's a second point about his empiricism, and that is that Locke distinguishes between simple and complex ideas. Simple and complex ideas. Now, a complex idea is an idea composed of ideas. A complex idea is an idea composed of ideas. A simple idea is an idea that's not composed of ideas. It is an idea, but it's not composed of any ideas except modally itself. It's not made up. It does not have any ideas as parts. Now, once the mind is stored with simple ideas through sensation, the mind can recombine simple ideas to make complex ideas. We can recombine simple ideas to make complex ideas. So, you know, if you have the perception of a horse and a perception of a human being, you can make the complex idea of a centaur, even though nobody's ever seen a centaur. Now, that's all our imaginations can do. That's all our imaginations can do. We can formulate these ideas in such a way that they represent accurately or inaccurately the external world, but that's the limit of our understanding. This is empiricism. Now, there's a third distinction, which is part of his empiricism, which is very famous in Locke. Locke draws a distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. Now, primary qualities are, well, all these qualities are qualities of physical objects. By qualities, he means characteristics or properties of physical objects. Now, primary qualities, he gives examples of them: solidity, extension, figure, motion, rest, and number. Solidity, extension, figure, motion, rest, or number. Now, I better translate these into modern English, no matter how misleading it is to do that. By solidity, Locke means that feature of a physical object. We write PO instead of physical object, it would take forever otherwise. That feature of a PO, according to which it cannot occupy the same space at the same time as another PO. All right? So Locke thinks two physical objects can't occupy the same, we'll call it space-time. The feature in virtue of which this is impossible is known as solidity. To put it crudely, physical objects bounce off one another if you try and push them into the same portion of space-time. Now, by extension, the second primary quality, he means size. Locke's word extension, the 17th century word extension, means size. The third primary quality, figure. Figure means shape. Motion or rest, that's all right. And number. By number, he means how many physical objects there are, or the number of physical objects there are, either globally or in this room or in the senior common room or wherever. By number, he means the number of physical objects there are in some relevant domain. Now, these primary qualities belong to a physical object, whether it's perceived or not. These primary qualities belong to a physical object, whether it's perceived or not. There's a second important feature of the primary qualities. The primary qualities are necessary conditions for something's being a physical object. They are necessary conditions for something's being a physical object. So if X lacks any of these primary qualities, it follows that X is not a physical object. And if X has all these physical properties, these primary qualities, it follows that X is a physical object. This is what Locke thinks. These are the primary qualities. Now, We move next on to secondary qualities, and Locke gives examples of secondary qualities. He says secondary qualities are colours, sounds, taste, smell, light. I mean, he has that as a separate one from colours, but he means how light or dark the object is in its appearance to us, right? Colour, sound, taste, smell, light. Now, if you look at the secondary literature on Locke, there's a common mistake. Many commentators on Locke say that the secondary qualities don't belong to the physical object unperceived. The secondary qualities don't belong to the physical object unperceived. But this is not quite accurate. What Locke says is that the secondary qualities are out there. They really are out there as properties of the object, independently of us, but only as powers, or only as dispositions, or only as potentials to cause sensations of taste, smell, colour in us. Now, the secondary qualities are the powers of the object, right? Or another way in which Locke draws this distinction between primary and secondary qualities is Locke says that ideas of primary qualities resemble the qualities. Ideas of primary qualities resemble the qualities. So my idea of shape resembles shape, or my idea of size resembles size. But ideas of secondary qualities do not resemble secondary qualities. So your idea, in the broad sense, your experience or idea or perception of smell, colour and taste does not resemble the power in the object to produce that idea, which is the secondary quality. Now, I mention this because it means that Locke's view is slightly more subtle, complex and convoluted than it's often taken to be. Now, Locke is a mind-body dualist like Descartes, and Locke thinks that there are physical substances and mental substances. He thinks that as a mental substance, for which we can read consciousness, really, as a consciousness, you are directly acquainted with the consciousness that you are. Or as a mental substance, you are directly acquainted with the mental substance that you are. The kind of empiricism based on reflection. But we know, according to Locke, that there are physical substances because we know that there's a cause of our ideas, and the cause of our ideas is the physical objects, the set of physical objects. And it's in virtue of their primary qualities that they have powers to affect us. Now, Locke, as I've said, thinks that two physical objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time. Locke thinks that two consciousnesses cannot occupy the same space at the same time. Now, it might seem odd for Locke to be talking about the possibility or impossibility of consciousness occupying space. But Descartes thinks that consciousness is not spatial. Descartes thinks that consciousness is not in space. Descartes thinks that if you're doing some mental arithmetic, you could time yourself with a stopwatch, consciousness is in time. But a neurologist is not going to find your mental arithmetic, no matter how closely he studies your neurology. Therefore, for Descartes, consciousness is not in space, but thought at least is in time. But Locke thinks that consciousness has a kind of spatiality. The soul is a kind of space, according to Locke. And he thinks if you attend sufficiently closely to this, you can just notice it. We don't notice it most of the time. We're too busy doing other things. We're concerned with physical objects. But if we were to pay attention to our own consciousness, we'd be aware that consciousness has a certain spatiality to it, an unchanging spatiality. Now, as I just said, two POs can't be in the same place at the same time. Two souls can't be in the same place at the same time. But a consciousness can be where a physical object is. A consciousness can be where a physical object is, and that is our nature. That's our nature. You are a consciousness that is where your body is, or you're a consciousness, so to speak, centered on this body, or this body is at the center of the space of your consciousness. This consciousness that you are is the same thing as the soul. Now, I'll just say something about Locke's view of language, because it's quite interesting. Well, that's where your interest lies. But the thing is, it seems to me that Locke and the later Wittgenstein have diametrically opposed philosophy of language. Now, you must know a bit about later Wittgenstein. Nobody can be in the University of Oxford doing philosophy without this, and escape Wittgenstein for very long. Now, Locke thinks that the private intelligibility of experience, makes possible communication. Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, let's be later Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein thinks that communication, or more subtly, the possibility of communication, makes possible the private interpretation of experience, makes possible the private communication of experience, which roughly means for Wittgenstein we have to give up on calling it private, but never mind that. Now, on Locke's theory, language works as follows. Number one, I am acquainted with my ideas. Number two, I speak or write. Number three, you are caused to have an idea numerically distinct from my idea, but qualitatively similar to my idea. So in Locke's philosophy, ideas make communication possible, and there wouldn't be any communication unless there were ideas. But ideas is understood so broadly here, again in Locke, as to mean not only mental images, but also concepts and even experiences. Now, in Wittgenstein, it's the possibility of rule-governed communication, the entering into a public language, which is governed by rules with public criteria for the applicability or inapplicability of concepts, that makes possible the having of ideas, or the having of sensations that one could find intelligible. It's public rule following, it's entering into that system of public rules that makes possible the intelligibility of one's own mind to oneself. So for Wittgenstein, really, there can be no solipsistic understanding, or there can be no solitary understanding. Understanding is essentially or necessarily public or social. Now, it's interesting, or slightly interesting, that Locke and Wittgenstein have diametrically opposed theories of meaning. It seems to me that, except in the order of priorities, the order of necessary conditions that they provide, their two philosophies are not incompatible, and it might be, for all the sophistication of these two thinkers, each of them has only 50% of a theory of meaning. And if we could synthesize Locke and Wittgenstein, we might have a theory of meaning that explains how language works. I'll just tell you how difficult it is to understand how language works. One of the things that's happening as I try to tell you about these things is that sounds come from priests' face. Sounds come from priests' face. But somehow there's more to words, sentences, understanding, sense, reference, than just sound. Somehow this sound is meaningful. Now, in philosophy, at this point, we wheel in a huge battery of ideas to try and understand this. We say, well, look, there are meanings, there are concepts, there are senses, there are conventions, there are rules, there's public understanding. But where is all that really? Where is all that really? I mean, here's the neurology, here's the technicolor phenomenology, here are the sounds still coming out of his mouth. Where's the meaning or sense or reference or whatever? So, or supposing someone was to write on this blackboard with a felt tip, and they said, a black one say, and we say, well, here is the distribution of ink molecules, here are the black shapes. What is it that makes these black shapes into words, sentences, concepts? We might say, well, it's consciousness. Well, I'm conscious of them. I'm aware of them. It's terribly hard. You might say, well, in order for language to work, there has to be a belief system. But what is it that turns all this into beliefs? I mean, supposing I say, I swear to you it's true, a tiger is going to come through the door now and start biting us. I swear this is the gospel truth. The tiger's on its way, it's going to eat us. May I be struck down if this is false. It's absolutely true. It's beyond a shadow of doubt true. It's absolutely certain. I believe it. It doesn't follow that I believe it at all. Not in the least bit. Not in the least bit. Something switches this into a belief. We haven't got any idea what. We haven't got any idea what. We haven't got any idea. And it's the same with the meanings. It's the same with the meanings. I've got some friends in Oxford who are Polish, and my Polish isn't just bad, isn't it? Pretty well non-existent, except for one word I'm quite familiar with that. When the Poles first came here, they couldn't understand much English, but clearly English was running through their minds. We're going to, something like, oh yes, meet you later today. They'd hear that sound. Now somebody could run the sound, meet you later today, through their mind, but they wouldn't thereby understand it. Now you might say, oh well, what's missing here is reference. What's meeting here is reference. If somebody says there are black taxis on St. Giles, the sounds coming out of him refer to the black taxis on St. Giles, but actually there's nothing that seems to connect these sounds to the black taxis on St. Giles. There's no shadowy piece of string going from these sounds to the taxis on St. Giles. We really don't understand how language works. So, I mean, I'm telling you these things so you can see that there are philosophical problems which we need methods of solving, and motivates maybe putting Locke and Wittgenstein together. Now, in the final 10 or 15 minutes, I'll say something about Berkeley, the Anglo-Irish 18th century Anglican bishop, who's a very interesting thinker. Now, Berkeley is an idealist philosopher. In other words, Berkeley thinks that unless consciousness exists, nothing exists. And Berkeley thinks that everything physical is really mental, or at least very closely, for example, logically, depends upon mentality for its existence. Now, people have regarded this as an insane philosophy, because it seems to imply that there are no physical objects, or physical objects do not exist independently of our perception of them, or that there's no external world that's physical, or there are no physical substances. And it seems contrary to common sense to take this view. When years ago I wrote a book for Penguins, Penguin Books in the UK, called Theories of the Mind, the Penguin editor said, "Oh, this is all very good, Steve, and it's just, do you need Bishop Berkeley in the book?" Meaning that it was so beyond the pale, it was so ridiculous, so implausible as not to be taken seriously intellectually. But Berkeley's view does have those endowments about physical objects not being mind independent and there being no physical substances, but his view is much more subtle than we might suppose, and it might even be true. And there are thinkers from two directions who, like Berkeley, one direction is people of a mystical frame of mind, people who've had mystical experiences, secular ones or religious ones. Mystics see some plausibility in Berkeley's writings, and on some interpretations of quantum physics, the quantum reality of the world, the quantum level of reality, seems to presuppose consciousness. Not on every interpretation of quantum physics, of course not, but on some fairly widely entertained and plausible ones, the truth of quantum physics presupposes consciousness. In other words, the quantum level of existence can only be if there's consciousness. And of course, the macroscopic Einsteinian, Newtonian world that we see around us now does depend on quantum reality. Now, if there turns out to be anything in that, far from being some sort of fool, Berkeley will provide us with the next paradigm for the philosophy of science, or underpinning of science. But it's too early to tell yet. We're still locked in a Victorian view of science. Now, Berkeley says that in the case of physical objects, esse est percipi. Esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. esse est percipi. In other words, to talk about a physical object existing and a physical object being perceived are exactly the same thing, according to Berkeley. Now, why should he think this? To go back, it just seems like it's men in white coats should appear. Well, the first thing, according to Berkeley, is that we've never come across anything else. We've never come across any physical object unperceived. So he insists that he's a strict empiricist. He says that his philosophy is far more strictly empiricist than the philosophy of John Locke, for example. Secondly, Berkeley says, misreading Locke with lots of other people, well, that doesn't matter in a way, it's a kind of historical point. Berkeley says that secondary qualities are relative. Secondary qualities are relative to the perceiver. Water feels hot to this hand, but cold to this hand. This object looks green in this light, blue in this light. You're familiar with the idea. Secondary qualities fluctuate according to the perspective or state of mind or condition of the observer. But, Berkeley says, Locke's primary qualities are just as relative and subjective as the secondary qualities. The primary qualities are just as relative and subjective. What he means is that an object looks like that from that angle, but that from that angle, that from that angle, that from that angle, that from that angle, like that from that angle. What is it like really? What is it like really? There's no such sense in that question. There's no sense in that question according to Berkeley. There's only the way things appear. Now, the third thing is that according to things, they're really little arguments that he had. The third argument he has for his idealism is that the expression physical substance is meaningless. The expression physical substance is meaningless. Now, physical substance is matter. And physical substance is whatever bears properties. In Locke's philosophy, for example, physical substance is whatever the properties of a physical object are properties of. Whatever the properties of a physical object are properties of is a physical substance, according to Locke. That's how he understands the term. Now, Berkeley, in his writings, says that he can understand the colour of the object and the sound of the object and the shape and the size and so on, but not the idea of physical substance, the idea that there's a kind of indistinct kernel or middle or owner of the properties of a physical object is an idea that he says is unintelligible. I mean, roughly speaking, in Locke, the properties of a physical object are the properties of a physical substance called matter. Roughly speaking, in Berkeley, the properties of a physical object are properties of one another. But he has a fourth argument, which is that because there's no physical substance, there can't be any physical cause of our ideas, but it is absolutely indubitable that we have ideas in the sense of images and experiences. Berkeley, also under the heading of causation, says that only similar things can cause one another. If there were physical objects, they could only cause physical objects. there are ideas, but ideas can only cause ideas. It's not possible for physical objects to cause ideas. He thinks that would give rise to the mind-body problem, the insuperable difficulty of trying to show what the relationship is between a physical object and something mental. His solution is to dispense with the physical object. I mean, in dispensing with the physical objects, Berkeley, if he was in this room, would agree that we're here, that this whiteboard is here, that the books are here, and so on. He'd just say that these are not mind-independent substances. They're dependent on our consciousness of them. Now, there's a debate. Those are his main arguments. I mean, he says that we can't imagine physical substance either. But those are the main lines of argument that he has. Now, there's a debate in the literature about Berkeley, about whether Berkeley is a phenomenalist. Now, phenomenalism is an empirical theory of perception, and phenomenalism is the doctrine that any sentence or set of sentences about physical objects, any sentence or set of sentences about physical objects can be translated into a sentence or set of sentences about sense impressions or ideas or experiences. Okay? It's an empiricist translation project. In saying that any sentence or theory or group of sentences about physical objects can be translated into sentences about experiences, it's clearly an extreme form of empiricism. They mean translated without any loss of meaning. It's important. They mean there's no loss of meaning. Now, that might sound sort of a slightly abstract theory, but what it means, or what it boils down to, is supposing somebody, Locke or somebody, said, no, there's a pub on the other side of St Giles called the Lamb and Flag. Well, a phenomenalist would say that the claim that this pub, the Lamb and Flag, exists is equivalent to certain feelings of coldness and hardness that in the physical object language we refer to as stones, or certain sounds that we would call the tinkling of glasses and so on. In other words, on a phenomenalist view, there's an extremely close tie. There's an extremely close tie between what we can experience and what we can count as a physical object. An extremely close connection between the possibility of experience, and the existence of physical objects. Now, phenomenalists think that these two can't come apart. We don't have the beliefs or knowledge that we have about physical objects independently of our experience of physical objects. But this is not just some causal claim about how we came to know there are physical objects. It's not some genetic account. The possibility of those sensations is equivalent to saying that the Lamb and Flag exists. It's the same thing as saying to the Lamb and Flag exists. To talk about the Lamb and Flag existing is to say something logically equivalent to, or if and only if these sensations of smell and texture are there. Now, it's characteristic of empiricism that our knowledge is constrained in this way, that on an empiricist view, typically, you can only know something as though you were perceiving it. You can only know something, anything, as though you were perceiving it, as though you were perceiving it. If you think you've got knowledge of the United States, or Britain, or London, or New York, or your flat, or where you're renting, or if you're buying, or whatever, you can only know that insofar as it's presented to you as it would be if you were perceiving it. You can only think of paper as it would be if you were perceiving it. And this is a constraint on our knowledge or our understanding. Right, we'll leave it there for this week. I just wanted to ask you something, actually. Did Blackfriars or David